What does it mean to truly care for someone? Not just as a patient, but as a person. When we think of healthcare, we think of medicine, diagnosing symptoms, prescribing treatments, fixing what's broken, but sometimes healing isn't about medicine at all. Sometimes it's about listening. So, I sat down with Eva Fenton, a CNA instructor with years of experience in this field, expecting to hear about the technical side of nursing, the grueling shifts, clinical skills, the challenges of training new CNAs, but what she told me wasn't about procedures or protocols, it was about purpose. So when she told me about Mr. Thompson, an 88-year-old former firefighter, a man who had spent his life saving others, now spending his last days watching the world outside his window, a man who had one final wish, not for medicine, not for time, but for something far simpler, one dance under the stars. This is Beyond the Chart. I'm Iris, and today we're talking about the moments in healthcare that matter the most, the ones that remind us that nursing is more than just medicine.
I sat across from Eva Fenton. She was a certified nursing assistant, commonly known as a CNA, for 9 years. She's recently become a licensed vocational nurse for the last 3 years. She's currently teaching and leading students like me in a CNA theory and clinical training and has spent the last decade dedicated to caring for residents and patients, whether they were 3 or 90 years old. Eva is the kind of nurse who doesn't just teach from textbooks. She teaches from experience, and for moments that I've stayed with her long after her shifts ended and after our clinicals and after our theory classes, I sat down to interview her. She leaned back in her chair slightly, fingers absently tracing the rim of her untouched coffee. There was a small smirk on her lips, not of amusement but of recognition, like she already knew I wasn't prepared for the story she was about to tell. Like she had lived through something that wasn't just a memory, but a truth that had settled deep inside her. And then she told me about Mr. Thompson. He was 88 years old, a former firefighter, a man who had spent his life saving others, but now he sat alone watching the world pass by through a window. I noticed the way his fingers would tap against the armrest of his chair, she said, tilting her head slightly as if still seeing him in that moment. Like he was hearing music no one else could. That detail struck me. It wasn't in a patient chart. It wasn't something that could be measured or diagnosed, but Eva noticed. In a place where people come and go, where healthcare workers are constantly pulled in hundreds of directions, she saw him. Not just as another elderly resident, but as a person who had lived, loved, and now sat waiting for something he hadn't quite found again. One day, as she adjusted his blanket while repositioning him, she saw it. An old photograph sitting on his bedside. A younger version of Mr. Thompson stood beside a woman with bright, laughing eyes and a smile that felt alive, even through the faded edges of time. She was my wife, he told her, his voice rough with age but softened by something more fragile. Margaret. We danced every night, haven't danced in years. Eva let out a small laugh at this part, shaking her head slightly. The way he said it, she murmured, like he could still hear the music. And so she sat with him more, listened. He told her stories of running into burning buildings, of the love of his life, of forgotten songs that still played in his mind like echoes from another time. Sometimes, when he thought no one was paying attention, she would hear him humming an old jazz under his breath. But time is relentless. His body weakened, his breath grew more labored, his hands, once strong, became frail, and then one night, as Eva was finishing her shift, he reached for her. His voice trembled, and his fingers clutched at her wrist, his chest ringing and falling in uneven breaths. His voice was barely there. Eva, she whispered, mimicking the way he rasped her name. He paused. I just want to see one more night sky, one more dance under the stars. She stopped there, sitting back slightly, exhaling slowly. I noticed the way her shoulders rose and fell. As if even now, all these years later, she was still carrying the weight of that moment. That night, when the halls of the nursing home had gone quiet, she wheeled him outside. The stars burned bright above them, scattered across the sky like something endless. The cool air wrapped around them, still and calm. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and found an old jazz tune, something close to what he used to hum. The melody floated into the night, soft and full of memory. And then she took his hands. He swayed, she said, her voice softer now, almost as if she was afraid of breaking the moment by speaking too loudly. Just barely, but enough to feel it, enough to remember. The next morning, he was gone. Eva described it as peaceful, like he had finally found what he had been searching for beyond that window. She sat with him for a while after, just listening to the hush of the room, letting herself believe that he had left this world with joy in his heart. She turned to look at me, and her gaze was steady. There was no hesitation in her words. no doubt in what she'd learned. Being a nurse isn't just about medicine. It's about moments, it's about dignity, it's about making sure in the end no one leaves this world feeling alone. And at that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Before this interview, I thought of nursing as primarily about diagnosis and treatment, about identifying symptoms, prescribing medicine, understanding the body's systems, and knowing how to fix them when they fail. But now, I know it's so much more than that. Nursing isn't about treating illness, it's about treating the person. Mr. Thompson's pain wasn't just in his body, it was in his longing, in the moments that still played in his mind, in the song that lived inside him even as his breath became too shallow to hum it. And Eva knew that. She saw that what he needed, not just medical care, but something deeper, connection, understanding. A way to hold on to himself even as his body failed him. And it made me wonder, how many patients go unseen? How many people live their final days in silence, longing for something no one bothers to ask about? How often do we reduce a person to their diagnosis rather than seeing them for the life they've lived, and the things that matter to them, and the things that aren't ready to let go of? It made me realize that effective diagnosis and treatment aren't just about science. They depend on truly knowing the person you're caring for. Medicine can heal the body, but only human connection can heal the soul. Eva stood at the end of her conversation, stretching slightly, ready to move on with her day. I could see it in the way she carried herself. This was one of the many stories, one of the many moments that had shaped her. But I sat there a little longer, staring at my notes, replaying her words in my head, because this wasn't just a story. This was the kind of lesson that stays with you. And maybe one day it will become the reason I become the kind of nurse who doesn't just treat patients, but truly cares for them.